everybody, and welcome to Denny Library. Thank you for coming out. It's really nice to have an in-person event finally, isn't it? Thanks for coming. So today we are here to hear about Castle Rankine prisoner of war camp, and Geoff has come to tell us all about it. The format of the event is Geoff's going to introduce Castle Rankine prisoner of war camp. We're going to view a short film on the big television here. And then we're going to have a question and answer session. And I've got some extra questions from the online people who couldn't be here tonight, so I will be asking those as well. So without further ado, here's Geoff.
Today is Holocaust Memorial Day, which is why we're holding the event on this particular night. This afternoon, Provost Billy Buchanan had an event over at Bonnybridge at the War Memorial there with quite a number of the schools involved. The POW camp at Castle Rankine is actually, quite a good theme for Holocaust Memorial Day because it's all about displacement and cultural loss that occurred at the time. Because not only did we have, first of all, the Italians and then the Germans, but then, of course, it was used for displaced persons and the EVWs and then the foreign workers. So these are people who are from Eastern Europe. As a result of war, they've lost everything. They've lost their possessions. They've lost their families. And I know it's not quite the same as the Holocaust, but it is a reflection of the events involved in that time. So that's the main reason for running this tonight. Let's see what it plays like. During the Second World War and immediately thereafterwards, in a small field just at the back of Denny, 1.5 miles to the southwest of the town centre, there was a hutted encampment. It started life as an encampment for internees. It then became a POW camp and later on a hostel for foreign workers. Now there's almost nothing to see on the field and it's beginning to fade from memory, but it shouldn't be. So what we're going to look at now is the story of Castle Rankine camp. On the 10th of June 1940, just as France was about to capitulate to the invading Germans, Italy joined the war, unfortunately on the side of the Germans. In Britain, people felt as though they'd been stabbed in the back at the moment of dire need, and so there was a huge upsurge in resentment against the Italian community. In Falkirk, the Italians were owners of fish and chip shops, very well known for that, and quite a number of the shops had their windows smashed as a result. The Italians, aged between 60 and 70, who were in the Falkirk district for less than 20 years, and they were first generation, were ordered to be interned. They were classified as enemy aliens, and within a few days, they were bussed from Falkirk police station to Denny, carrying very, very few possessions. The place they were going, which was to be their home for almost a year, was the field that we mentioned, which had very quickly been assembled into a camp with wooden huts and canvas tents. Fortunately, of course, it wasn't too far away from Falkirk, and so their families, their Scottish wives and children, were able to visit them and provide food and comforts for them. And the families also looked after the fish and chip shops whilst they were interned. The war, of course, dragged on for numbers of years, and in North Africa, the campaign was rampant. By the end of 1941, there were an awful lot of Italian prisoners of war being shipped back into Britain, and the authorities needed to find somewhere to house these people. Scotland was an obvious place because it was quite a distance from the centre of the major activity, and so right at the very end of that year it was decided to upgrade the camp at Castle Rankine into a POW camp. The camp itself was divided into zones. It was very, very quickly built, and within months there were 300 to 400 Italian POWs there. They were quite happy to be out of the war, actually, and spent a lot of time chatting to the workmen building the camp and to the local people. They picked up English slowly, and amongst the first things, of course, that they asked for was hair cream and toothpaste. The sergeant major of the Italians was a kind of plumpish man who used to bawl and shout orders out to the men and would turn red in the face whilst doing so. The camp guards were Pioneer Corps, who were not first-rate troops, but they were quite adequate to protect men who didn't particularly want to escape. The camp was surrounded by a tall barbed wire fence. Anyone could have escaped if they'd really wanted to. It was divided into zones. So if you were entering from the minor road from Denny, on the right-hand side there was the old pit bing, and on the left-hand side was the accommodation for the camp guard and the administration. Straight on would have been the compound, which eventually housed 40 prefabricated huts made with concrete frames, concrete panels, and some brick infill on concrete platforms. They had to be terraced into the hill slope, and along the main streets they hung Benjamin lamps. So they were suspended from wires, and of course on the windswept site they would blow around in the wind quite a lot. One of the huts was used as a multi-purpose recreation centre. So on the Sundays it served as a chapel, and as normal the Italians decorated the walls of the chapel with artwork. Along one side of it was a bench, and that was used for recreational purposes such as making musical instruments, violins, guitars, and making small boxes which were then decorated with images from the African campaigns, so they would show camels and pyramids and things of that nature. Beyond the main accommodation area was an enclosed area used as allotments and gardens. That allowed the Italians to grow some of their own food, which they would then make. And further north still was the steep valley of the Castle Rankine burn. And here the Italians formed a path down the steep slope so that they could get to the pool in the stream and use that for bathing in the summer months. And they also learned how to guddle fish, which they would then cook in the canteen. Whilst the Italians were occupying the POW camp at Denny, it was realised that they could fulfil the shortage of labour on the local farms. Tractors had only been introduced relatively recently, and there was very little mechanisation, so the labour that they provided was essential. They also got to work in some of the local industries, in the paper mill at Carron Grove, for example, and at the brickworks in Bonnybridge at Castle Carey and Milne Quarter. After the Battle of El Alamein, numbers of Italian POWs at Denny increased substantially, reaching a peak of just over 600 eventually. But in September 1943, the Italians surrendered. They essentially swapped sides, and the Italians at Denny were given a lot more freedom. Having said that, of course, by that stage the name Tally Camp was ingrained into the local memory. The strangers in amongst the local community were seen as quite exotic, and for some reason that seemed to attract a lot of the local girls. So much so that a policeman was put on duty at the end of the road, and although it was a public road, he was able to demand that they show their identity cards, and quite a number of the girls were fined for not having signed them. A huge whopping sum of 20 shillings at that time. Probably much worse than that was the fact that their names were printed in the Falkirk Herald, and you have to imagine the family discussions that would have ensued from that. The local boys, of course, hated the Italians. They saw them as smooth-talking, greasy yobs, stealing their girls. On the other hand, some thought that they showed a great deal of audacity and had silver tongues. So it's a point of view. I spoke to one person who was a member of the Post Office Home Guard, and at night when he was on guard duty in the telephone exchange, he had very little to do, and he used to spend his time listening to the Italians chatting up the women. And he reckoned he learnt a lot of tricks to do of how to handle women. At least that's what he said. Colonel Lieutenant Hans Miller, who was the commandant at the camp, was very interested in music and orchestras, and he encouraged the Italians to form their own orchestra. They had the musical instruments that they made. They were also able to get donations and borrow some from the local community. After a great deal of practice, on the 27th of August 1945, they eventually had a public performance in the Cinema Deluxe. There were 2 performances, and because Miller wanted to show the kind of work that the Italians were doing, he invited the local people and the leaders of the boroughs in the area. So Provost Allen of Denny and Provost Strachan of Falkirk both came to listen to the music. However, the Provost of Stirling and some of his councillors completely refused to have anything to do with fraternising with the enemy, and in fact sent some rather scathing remarks. Well, if you do that in Denny, it acts as a great publicity stunt, and the place was packed out. 2 performances. The evening one, they had to turn people away because there was such great demand. The performance was in the aid of Denny and District Comforts Fund and raised £130 for that particular thing. And as you can imagine, there was Italian opera involved. It was a great success, and several other performances followed there afterwards. However, in February 1946, it was decided that the Italians had been amongst us for long enough, and they marched to Larbert railway station for entrainment down to the south coast of England and the journey home. The departure was met with a great deal of mixed feelings amongst the community. There was a lot of friendship at the time. Probably just as importantly, it meant that the places of entertainment and the shops were going to suffer in terms of their trade. And then a rumour started to arise that they were going to be replaced by German POWs. In March 1946, the expected German invasion happened. Some 700 Germans eventually arrived at the prisoner of war camp in Denny. They arrived by train at Larbert Station, formed up and marched the short distance. One young girl remembered them arriving when she was in the playground at the school, and she said a lot of the children spat at them as they passed. One farmer who lived just outside Stirling recalled the Germans first arriving in time for the potato harvest that year. There was about 20 soldiers. They were lined up and stood to attention by the sergeant, who then spoke to the farmer, asked which fields needed picking. He marched the men out to the fields, and they worked very hard throughout the harvest. And it was often said that whilst the Italians were fun-loving, and you'd often hear them singing whilst they were working, the Germans were very hard-working. They tended not to hang around waiting to be told what to do. They went out and did whatever was required. At the end of that potato harvest, the farmer was allowed to retain 3 of the German POWs. He chose the sergeant because he previously worked on farms before the war. The second person he chose was a 17-year-old whose father was a minister in Hamburg. And then the third person was someone who lived near the Polish border and whose family had been severely mistreated by the Nazis. The camp at Castle Rankine was now fully developed. There was a medical block where the German doctors, amongst the POWs, looked after their fellow prisoners. And there was a bakery where they did their own baking, a workshop where they would make toys and little trinkets as souvenirs, which they could then give away. There was a canteen, again, they did their own cooking, a games and recreation room where they were able to play things like billiards and table tennis, dominoes, cards and the like. They had gardens, just like the Italians, where they grew flowers for competition, as well as growing their own vegetables. And then finally, they constructed a concert hall, which was made out of two long army huts. They took the sides out of the huts and grafted the two together. And that was able to sit 600 people in the audience, as well as having a stage at the far end. In July that year, Hans Miller, the camp commandant, decided that they were ready for a public performance, and he invited the farmers on whose farms the men were billeted and their wives along to attend the concert. It was a great success, and therefore was repeated on St Andrew's Day later in the year. On that particular St Andrew's Day, they performed Holy Night using their own arrangement. And again, that was so well received that they performed it in a number of the churches in Denny itself for that Christmas. The orchestra also had the opportunity to record the music at Bigger's recording studios in Glasgow. The camp itself continued on until May 1947, when they held the last concert, and by the end of that month, the prisoners had all left Scotland and returned to Germany. And an eerie silence fell over the field and over the town of Denny itself. Didn't last long, because in February 1948, a new human cargo arrived in Denny, this time arriving at Denny Station, which was deliberately opened for that particular day. These were foreigners again, mainly Ukrainians, Yugoslavs and Poles, who had volunteered to replace the Germans working on the local farms. They would have been described initially as DPs, meaning displaced persons, but eventually they were known by the title of EVWs rather than POWs, and that stood for European Voluntary Workers. The camp now was called a hostel, and there were families as well as the menfolk themselves. It must have been a very strange time for them. Most were not able to return to their homes because of the economic situation, or because they were in the hands of the communists further east. They'd come to an alien culture, an alien climate, and it was very difficult for them to adapt to the locality. By 1953, a new term had arisen, so instead of being EVWs, they were now called foreign workers. And that year, of course, the camp eventually closed permanently. It was taken over by a local businessman who took Gunter Ilgner into partnership. Gunter had actually been a guest at the camp whilst it was a German POW camp, and they used it as a pig farm. Eventually, Gunter actually got to own the farm in which he'd been detained as a prisoner. Now, of course, the sheds are completely gone. There's very little to see on the site other than green fields. But although it's fading from the memory, it should not be forgotten, because what it represents is shattered lives, reconciliation, friendship, and new beginnings. And that's what we should all be thinking about. So that's what's going to go on the websites, and people will be able to view that in the future. And as I say, spot all the errors that are in there. At the same time, we've written an article which is about 16 pages long, which has gone to the Falkirk Local History Society's website. So we're doing technology very much in these cases. It means I won't need to go around quite so much speaking all the time.
Now you've got to explain it all.
The article, of course, that we put on the website has some of the stories that we had to omit from here. You may remember at the beginning we talked about the Italian sergeant major who was rather plumpish and used to bawl out the orders, and who was told had a very, very powerful voice, and his face turned red. But he also had another trick up his sleeve in that he had steel teeth, which were chrome plated, and he used to take a nail and bite it and then show you the bite print on the nail. So everyone's got their own party piece. And it's that kind of stuff that makes it a human story, isn't it? It's that kind of stuff that takes you out of just numbers and, members of armies to individuals. But on the other extreme of that, of course, you have right at the end some of those European voluntary workers coming to this part of the world and committing suicide here. It was a dreadful experience for them. Not coming to Denny, but having been, thrown out and ejected from their own part of Europe. So do go and look at all these other things as well, and not obviously just this particular thing. So if there are any questions from the audience, quite happy to expand on what we've had on the screen, as I say, and fill in those gaps that we had to omit because of time pressure.
I think it'd be good if you explained the origins of Castle Rankine, because I had no idea about that before the event.
Yes, Naomi didn't realise that Castle Rankine was a castle originally. It's one of the earliest stone castles we have in the Falkirk district, and at the time of Edward I of England, the Countess of Sutherland was travelling down from the north through to the south, and they acquired her and held her for ransom at Castle Rankine. And eventually they had to pay up. And it was a very powerful castle. It had a big stone tower. It was unfortunately ended up in the hands of the Karen Company, who blew it up so that they could have a better agriculture on the field. Again, there is an article about Castle Rankine Castle on the Falkirk Local Society's website. It's very much also involved in the Wars of Independence. It's one of the few places where they would not go along with the English at any time. Really, you hear about Bill Wallace, but, the people who occupied Castle Rankine were very much the captains of the army of that time of independence.
One question, I don't know if you feel it all. After the capitulated in 1943,
June.
the value requested the prisoner would be repatriated. The value, national value. But they say, we'll wait just now. So in 1945, McMillan at that time, it was the foreign secretary, he says, no, he says, we'll keep them here, make them into a pioneer corps, and do what? That's the reason they were repatriated until 1946, late 1946. My father arrived back in his village in southern Italy in 1947. So in that time, they were also exploited as, well, we don't want to say slave labor, but they were employed.
Yeah. The Germans only went back in 1948.
That's right.
So they're long after the war as well. And part of the reason why the Germans were kept was part of a program of denazification. So a lot of the people who were at Castle Rankine, they weren't, first line Nazis, but they still had to be re-educated. And it was also considered a way of paying back, for having, created the war. The library that you saw in the film had loads of educational books about democracy. And that's why Germany now, you're not allowed to show a swastika, and they are very strongly into the democratic concept. With the Italians, it was acknowledged at the time that there was a huge labour shortage in agriculture in Britain. With so much of the army abroad still, because they couldn't just come back because the war was over. You had to get rid of the munitions abroad. They had to police it, particularly in places like Berlin. They were controlling the boundaries and the frontier. They were doing the airlift and stuff like that. And the Italians were kept on specifically to provide that labour force. Absolutely right. At the time, I don't think there was a huge outcry from the Italians or the Italian government. And in fact, the Italian government was having trouble feeding its own people at that time. So it wasn't a huge problem seen at the time. But you're right, it was actually against the rules of warfare. You are not supposed to detain people once the war is over.
Because there's not any social media then. They didn't know what was happening. They thought they were still prisoners. They were told to tell you they were still. Because my grandmother in Italy didn't receive a postcard in 1845 to say my father was alive. Now, he was captured in North Africa late 1941-42, and that's when she received it, because her other son had been captured by the Germans in Greece.
And certainly, when the Germans were in the POW camp at Castle Rankine, they were receiving postcards from Germany, and you occasionally see those up for sale on eBay. And they were sending postcards out because the POW camp, number 64, that's very collectible now, as you can imagine. So they were receiving postcards, they were sending postcards. But there was huge delays with them arriving and being sent. I mean, after Italy surrendered and then essentially swapped sides because they were disarmed by the Germans, so it was kind of hard for them to swap sides. The POWs here were given a huge amount of freedom. They had when they went out to the farms, they usually had a kind of a brown uniform with a red triangular patch or a yellow circular patch. Those patches were got rid of. They were allowed to wear almost battle dress, and now instead of having POW, they actually had the Italian, just Italy, across the bar on their shoulder. So they were kind of treated like displaced soldiers in a sense. I've received a large number of people tell me that the women queuing up for the cinema got too much treatment from these Italians as they were queuing up because they were allowed out. Before they surrendered, there was always a curfew. They had to be back at the camp. Or they had to be in the billets in the farms, because even before that they were billeted on farms. After the surrender, most of them were billeted out, and they went to the brickworks and places like that. One of my favourite stories in connection with the Italians is that, of course, they all got bicycles because it's a wee bit out to the town, three of them got fined for when they were coming down Duke Street and they got to the cross. They didn't stop; they went straight out. When they appeared in front of the local sheriff, the local court, the first instance, they said, this is the first time we've had this case, we'll dismiss it. And then the second one got fined, and then the third one got fined quite a lot. And it's like, all he did was, there's no traffic, just went straight out on a bicycle. And another one got fined for not having a torch on his bike. And at the time, of course, no one could buy batteries for their lights anyway. They had to have a permit for cycling. They had to have a permit for leaving the camp. They had to have a National Health Service card. They had to have a document saying what they'd brought with them, how much cash they'd earned, whilst they were at the camp, and so on and so on. So the bureaucrats were the winners by long chalk. When he went into the canteen, he found that the straw boards which lined it for insulation had got paintings on them, and they were done by a German called Otto Loeb. Those are now in the Smith Museum in Stirling. So it's good that those got saved. They show German cities, and he basically used whatever he could scratched together to do the painting. So although there's some oil paint and stuff in there, there's also shoe polish, because it makes a nice brown. So they are kind of rather darkish pictures. And it seems that he was using postcards that they'd received in the camp from relatives of these various places. So he wasn't just doing it from memory. Remember, there was a library there, so they may have had other photographs as well. So those survive. And then you saw on the film, there was the little tank, the wooden tank, because the Germans, in 1947-48, they made a lot of toys for the local children. These were skilled craftsmen by and large. And see, 1948, what did you mean by a toy? Well, you meant a wooden tank. You know, you didn't have electronic gizmos and stuff like that in those days. For a lot of children, this was the first real toys that they'd had, because everything was in such short supply. They handed the toys over to the provost of Denny and his wife, and they distributed them through the schools. So some of those toys survive, as well as the tank. I've seen a little wooden train. But I'm sure there's plenty more out there, hopefully. It was a slight problem for a lot of the Germans, of course, is that they were ashamed of what they'd done in the name of the SS. There were SS officers in there, and that's why some of those didn't go back to Germany at the end. It's a chaos. It's as I was saying, it's that concept that we don't understand it nowadays, because you're going with the times, and then you look back and you think, why the heck did I do that? Because some of the POWs were killed whilst they were working in industry as well. So one of the Italians fell through the roof at Cangrove paper mill and died as a result of his injuries. Another one was working at Castlecary Brickworks, loading the bricks onto railway wagons, and he got hit by an oncoming train. And a lot of people think that was probably suicide, because he should not have been anywhere near the main line. He was in the sidings, and he got hit by a mainline train. It's very difficult to understand what's going through people's minds at this time.
I've got a question from somebody who emailed it in, and it says, I have a portrait photo of my grandfather, so that's the grandfather, who was an Italian POW at the camp. I'm fascinated to know how he would have been able to have this taken. How could he have had the freedom to get a photo like this done? Would there have been facilities in the camp, or where else could it have been taken?
Right, well, remember what I said after Italy surrendered. They were then allowed to wear their uniforms, more or less, and you can just make out there the curve of the Italy badge on the side there. So this is obviously after they surrendered, and he would have had the freedom to go into Denny, where there were professional photographers who could have taken these things. I mean, one of the reasons why the site was chosen is because the pit being, there used to be an old pit there, so it was a derelict land, basically, and it was originally chosen, of course, for the detainees, not as a prisoner of war camp. So it started off as a wooded encampment with tents, and it was never meant to be permanent. So you think about going from that until 1953, when it was finally abandoned. It did pretty well to last so long. It wasn't because they thought Denny was the back end of beyond. It was just a convenient spot. I'm going to get lynched one of these days when I say things like that. I mean, one of the stories we left out was one of the German POWs got billeted on a farm at Inch in Larbert. And before the war, he'd been a forester. So whilst he was in Larbert, he used to go out hunting rabbits and hares and foxes and stuff like that, which augmented the diet of the family, and they were very appreciative of that. But not only that, of course, he used to then skin the animals, and they've still got a coat that was made for the daughter, a fur coat. Just like so many, he then kept in touch with the family when he went back to Germany. So there were friendships formed. The three soldiers that I mentioned that went out to Greenyard's farm over at St Ninian's at Bannockburn, The sergeant there kept in touch until he died. So it was strange in a sense that people who were really enemies in terms of the armies. But I remember speaking to one local woman, and she said, but see, if my son had been in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, I'd want some family there to look after him and adopt him.
I'm going to ask if photography was used to document things, or is it just...
Castle Rankine was one of many, many camps, and by and large the government, when it was documenting them, used to go to ones which were nearer to the centres of larger population centres, shall we say. Unfortunately, there is no records that I'm aware of for Denny. There's a small, very slender document in the Kew records down in London, and that's it. And it doesn't really tell us an awful lot. After the war, a lot of records were deliberately destroyed because Churchill reckoned it was better to put it behind you and just get on with the future, which is why every night on British television you'll see a programme about the Second World War. Thank you very much for your questions. That was wonderful.